Welcome to this session on involuntary status change and administrative fair process. At the 2012 General Conference, significant changes were made both to what is currently known as administrative and judicial complaint. This session will focus on the changes that have been made to administrative process. My name is Meg Lassiat, and I'm the Director of Candidacy, Mentoring, and Conference Relations at the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry. I work with district committees and boards of ordained ministry through the candidacy and ordination process and with issues related to changes in conference relationships for clergy. Administrative complaint, as it's currently called, or administrative fair process, as it will be called with the 2012 Book of Discipline, is the administrative process the church has established for working with clergy who are facing an involuntary status change that does not stem from a judicial complaint. The 4 status changes managed through the administrative fair process are administrative location, involuntary leave, involuntary retirement, and the involuntary discontinuance of a provisional member when that person appeals the board's recommendation for discontinuance. There were many reasons for submitting changes to the administrative and judicial complaint process. The first is that the process had become too convoluted, both for those managing it and for respondents or those against whom complaints were filed. When processes are too complicated, they tend to not get followed, which puts the clergy person and the church at risk during any complaint or fair process procedure. All the decisions annual conferences make about the conference relationship of candidates, provisional members, local pastors, and ordained clergy happen in covenant. These revisions reflect an effort to bring the implementation of and decisions about the administrative and judicial processes back to within the covenant of clergy members in the annual conference. And finally, there was a need to remove ineffectiveness from the judicial complaint process in order to alleviate the confusion of how to manage the difference between ineffectiveness and willful wrongdoing or moral and ethical misconduct. So here's where information about these relationships is in the Book of Discipline. The first column shows the 2008 discipline paragraphs, and on the right you can see the paragraph number changes for the 2012 discipline. In the 2012 discipline, administrative location has been given its own paragraph. It will be just after honorable location. Much of the new language for administrative location will mirror that of honorable location. The biggest difference, however, between the two is that those on administrative location are not allowed to serve in any ad interim or temporary appointment. When we look at the process paragraphs, the fair process procedures, the beginning of judicial complaint, and the disposition of recommendations of involuntary status change are in paragraphs 363 through 365 of the 2012 discipline. Part of what's reflected in the legislation is a better way to organize this area so that the process could be more easily understood by reading through the discipline, and hopefully some of the reorganization will help with that. In addition to the changes related to the implementation of fair process, I wanted to also share an overview of some other changes brought by this legislation. First of all, the complaint process is now clearly separated from administrative fair process. A complaint is now defined as a written and signed statement claiming misconduct, as defined in paragraph 2702.1. This means that a bishop no longer decides if a complaint is administrative or judicial. This was part of the process that was causing confusion in determining the correct way to process a complaint. By making the complaint process be solely focused on judicial complaint, as defined in paragraph 2702, and involuntary status change be focused on administrative process, The General Conference hoped to clarify which process is used in different circumstances. So ineffectiveness will no longer be managed as a judicial complaint. Ineffectiveness will now be handled through a recommendation for administrative location, which is managed by the Board of Ordained Ministry through a fair process hearing. For the board, one of the new requirements is the mandate that all boards have a conference relations committee. The committee must have at least 3 people with gender and racial diversity and is responsible for hearing all recommendations for an involuntary status change other than judicial complaint. Additionally, the Conference Relations Committee will handle requests for voluntary status change, such as voluntary leave or retirement. The Conference Relations Committee can also manage other issues assigned to them by the board. The committee is defined in paragraphs 363 and 635 in the 2012 discipline. As a district superintendent, there are issues that you will need to be aware of as well. District superintendents are prohibited from serving on the Conference Relations Committee. DSs are not to be present during deliberations among the Conference Relations Committee nor the Board of Ordained Ministry regarding an involuntary status change. This includes even the district superintendent who serves on the board as the cabinet representative, and also includes any deliberations the board may have for the involuntary discontinuance of a provisional member. However, the district superintendent may present the recommendation for the change and the reasons for the recommendation to the Conference Relations Committee. These mandates were made clear in Judicial Council Decisions 917 and 950 and are there to maintain separation between the board's responsibility to credential and the bishop and cabinet's responsibility to appoint. If you get into a fair process hearing, GBHEM has a checklist for fair process of administrative complaints. And I want to show you now where that is located on our website. If you navigate to gbhem.org/BOM and look in the right-hand margin, go down to about where you see that second PDF, and right now it's called a checklist for fair process of administrative complaints. That is the current fair process checklist and is posted here. This process will stay in effect until December 31st. The General Board of Higher Education and Ministry and the General Council on Finance and Administration are working together to develop a new checklist that will go into effect on January 1st, 2013. And it will be replaced. We'll put it right here in the same spot. So now we'll go back to the slides. As you work through an administrative process hearing, remember that it basically breaks down into 3 parts. There's the receipt of the recommendation for the change, the initial response to the recommendation, and then the decision for action or dismissal of the recommendation. If a recommendation for involuntary change is forwarded to the Board of Ordained Ministry, the board responds through its Conference Relations Committee, who holds a fair process hearing according to the provisions of paragraph 363. After the fair process hearing, the board then may affirm or deny the recommendation of the Conference Relations Committee. After the board decides on its recommendation, and before a recommendation is made to the clergy session for an involuntary status change, the Administrative Review Committee reviews all parts of the process to make sure disciplinary steps were followed throughout. The Administrative Review Committee may make recommendations to remedy any mistakes that have been made in the process, and will report to the clergy session to ensure that disciplinary procedures were followed before any final vote for an involuntary status change can occur. Based on the recommendation of the board, the vote of the clergy session determines the final decision on any recommendation for a status change. The board itself may place someone on administrative location between annual conference sessions, pending final approval by vote of the next clergy session. Keep in mind that any complaints or recommendations received between now and December 31st fall under the 2008 disciplinary process, while the new process goes into effect beginning January 1st, 2013. The procedures for a fair process hearing will be covered in detail at a workshop offered during the BOM quadrennial training event in October. Conference Relations Committee chairs and Boards of Ordained Ministry chairs may want to attend that workshop. But here are highlights for you to be aware of in your work on the Board of Ordained Ministry. The procedure for a fair process hearing has not changed. However, the 2012 discipline clarifies that administrative fair process must be followed for all recommendations for an involuntary status change. And the Administrative Fair Process Checklist, posted on GBHEM's website, is available to guide you through the procedures for any fair process hearing. There are a couple additional requirements to be aware of as well, involving the respondent's advocate in any fair process hearing and the access to pertinent materials before a hearing begins. Other changes coming out of this process include the requirement that the bishop informs the Board of Ordained Ministry chair when a supervisory response has begun, and the respondent's advocate must be a member in full connection of the respondent's annual conference. This points to the desire to have decisions about clergy membership made in the covenant of the annual conference, beginning with candidacy, ending with retirement, and anything in between. The outcome of a fair process hearing is now limited to an involuntary status change or to a decision of innocence. And this legislation clarifies that the board may affirm or reverse the recommendation of the Conference Relations Committee. There have also been quite a few questions about what has remained consistent. As I've said before, the actual procedure for administrative fair process has not changed. The United Methodist Church firmly believes that a holy covenant exists within the membership and organization of the church, and has developed these procedures for the protection of the rights of individuals and for the protection of the church in administrative and judicial hearings. The opportunity for a just resolution remains in the process. Paragraph 364, which focuses on judicial complaint, states that a process seeking a just resolution may begin at any time in the supervisory, complaint, or trial process. This, too, is an important component of our covenant for ministry. Clergy are still guaranteed a right of hearing by committee for decisions regarding involuntary status change, and the clergy executive session makes all final decisions regarding any status change for clergy. Thank you for your participation in this session. If you have additional questions, my contact information is listed here. And thank you for your work and your ministry on behalf of the United Methodist Church.